Amen. Last time in chapter 21, after 25 years, Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah. A young couple, only 190 years old. 190, not 190. Sarah was 90, Abraham was 100. Kind of a miracle, I would say. And then we saw strife between Ishmael and Isaac when Sarah saw Ishmael scoffing at Isaac. We learned in Galatians 4 that Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, and Ishmael were symbolic of the two covenants. Ishmael and Hagar were symbolic of the covenant of the law and works of the flesh. Acceptance by God based on man's good works or man's performance. Isaac and Sarah were symbolic of the covenant of God's promise. Acceptance by God based on God's grace and man's faith in God for God to perform, not us to perform, but for God to perform as he promised. And our conclusion last time was that there can be no coexistence between man's works and God's grace. We're either saved by our works or we're saved by God's grace. We can't add to God's grace. They have to be separated. And that's why Isaac and Ishmael needed to not coexist. And that continued, that same battle continued in Paul's day, where he had the Judaizers saying, yeah, Jesus is great and grace is good, but you have to add these works to it. They were trying to coexist. And Paul said, no, that can't be. And today we have Ishmael's descendants, the Arabs, who are mostly Arab. The Arabs, most of the Arabs are Arab. I figured that one right out. I didn't even have to Google it. The Arabs, most of them are Muslim. I think it's upwards of 90%. And those are Isaac's descendants. And God's people, whether they're Jewish or Christians, from the Arabs' perspective, they're enemies. The Arabs are scoffing at the Christians and the Jewish people. And we really can't coexist. So Abraham, in that issue, he obeyed God when God said, yeah, send Ishmael out. Send Hagar and Ishmael out. And, your son that you love, send him away. And he went to Saudi Arabia and became the Arab people. But that was quite an act of faith for Abraham because he loved his kids. I don't want to send him away. He's just a teenager. I'm going to send him away. But he demonstrated that he believed God. He didn't argue with God. God said you need to send him away. He didn't understand that they're going to be symbolic of works and grace. But Abraham believed God, that he knew what he was talking about, even if Abraham didn't understand. And he said, all right, and he sends him away. What's interesting is today we're going to step that up. That's going to be on steroids now, that same circumstance. He's going to demonstrate his trust for God, even when he doesn't get it. Now, I have an idea of how many hands might go up, but have any of you ever been in a situation where something's going on and you go, God, I just don't understand? Nobody? Yeah. Well, Abraham's a great example for us, that God is faithful and we can trust him even when we don't understand, even when we think it's crazy, as long as we know we're following God in this. So let's pick it up in chapter 22, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now after these things refers to Abraham obeying God by sending away Hagar and Ishmael. When it says God tested Abraham, the King James Version says God tempted Abraham. It's an unfortunate translation because James chapter 1 verse 13 and 14 says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. So apparently in today's English, tempt is not the correct word for this verse. More accurate translation would be tested or proved. Now, God already knows Abraham's faith, so when he's testing or proving his faith, who's he doing it for? Because God already knows. It's either Abraham or us or both of us. He tests Abraham or proves him so that we'll understand the quality of Abraham's faith and learn from it. And God said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Good response when God calls us. We see that many times in the Old Testament with the same answer. Abraham said it, Isaac said it, Samuel said it, Isaiah said it. In fact, Isaiah said, here I am, send me. What a great response. I don't know all the details, but here I am, send me. I'm your ready servant. Verse 2, then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. By the way, this is the first time the word love is in the Old Testament. And notice it's father and son. Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. How would you react to that? What? Yeah, but? Do I need a hearing aid? Is something wrong here? I'm hearing from you. Something's got to be wrong. You couldn't be saying that. But you notice that Abraham doesn't even question it. How can that be? I suggest that Abraham knew several things. He had a deep knowledge of God and his character. He knew Isaac's birth was a miracle. It was in accordance with your promise, God. And just in the last chapter, you told me that my seed would be through Isaac. And he hasn't had any kids yet. And you're not going to break your promise because I know your character. So I don't understand what's going on. You're telling me to do this. I trust you. I don't understand you, but I trust you. Because he knew God closely. He knew God's character, his love for him. What an awesome situation to be in. I desire that. I want to know God that well that no matter what he tells me, I know I can trust him, that he'll work it for my good. He says, now, take now your son, your only son whom you love. Well, how many sons did he have? He had two. Not one, two. So from this verse, we're learning that from God's perspective, Abraham had only one son. This is the son he's going to bring the Messiah through, that he promised way back in Genesis chapter 2. And he says, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, the land of Moriah is where modern-day Jerusalem is. Mount Moriah is where the temple was built. We read in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Pretty cool. He says, offer him there as a burnt offering. We studied this earlier, you guys. What does a burnt offering symbolize? We have fellowship offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings. What's a burnt offering for? This is Jeopardy. You got to hit your button. What was that? Colon? No idea. A burnt offering, what you do is you take the animal and you slay it, and then the whole thing goes on the altar and is completely consumed. So when you offer a burnt offering to the Lord, it's an offering of dedication. I'm symbolizing my dedication to you by, here's this valuable thing, and it's completely given over to you, Lord. Completely burned up. So burnt offering, I'm completely dedicating myself to you. Wasn't burnt alive, it was slayed first. Expression of total dedication. And so we can interpret that God is saying to Abraham, let's test your total dedication. I'm going to ask you to offer your most precious thing, your son whom you love, your only son whom you love. Now, in case you haven't figured it out, we have a mirror going on here. We have some symbology going on here. Because Abraham's offering is mirrored by God's offering. He offered his only son, whom he loved. And he did it to reconcile us. He's completely consumed. He's killed on the cross. And God's offering is so mirrored that Abraham's going to the exact spot where Jesus was offered. Isn't that interesting? It says, on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So go ahead and put up the first slide. I had a little trouble finding slides for this. It's nighttime in Jerusalem. There we go. Okay, so this is the Jebusite city that formed there later. You can see we've got a ridge here, and that goes on up. There's another step here, and then it goes on up. There's another step, and way up to here. Okay, so it's kind of this. You've got a ridge down here, a ridge here, and then you've got the Mount of Olives over here. And all you guys are going to see this who go to Israel with us. So David conquered this Jebusite city, but at the time of Abraham, this city wasn't there. So we've got this ridge, the temple. Go to the next slide, if you would. That's a little hard to see up here, I realize. Here's the city of David. Here's the temple built up there, going up the ridge. And they kind of leveled it. Go to the next one, if you would. Here they are together. So you can see the ridge going up like that. There's the temple, city of David. Now what they did to build the temple, if you go to the next slide, in Abraham's time they had just the ridge kind of going up. When they built the temple, they cut it here and leveled it, and then you have the city of David down here. And Jesus was crucified right up here. Where it's cut out, that's Golgotha. That's what looks like the skull. Because they excavated there, and you've got the rocks, and it's limestone, and there's holes, and it looks like a skull when you look at it. And we're going to go and see that. So let's go ahead and leave that up for a little bit. So he has the command, going off of your son. Next morning, I'm going to slinger around a cup of coffee and think about it. Maybe by the afternoon I'll get going. Verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off, and Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Starts off in verse 3, he rose early in the morning. There's no hesitation. He gets up early. Let's get going. Amazing, amazing faith. He saddles his donkey and he splits the wood for the burnt offering. Now, Abraham's a rich guy. He could have hired his servants. Split me a cord of wood. You go saddle the donkeys. I'm going to have my coffee and then we'll go when you're ready. No, he goes and does it himself. A real and true offering isn't something that you pay for. It's something that costs you something. Abraham gets up and does the work himself. He saddles his own donkey. He even splits the wood for the offering. He's an old guy. I have trouble splitting wood at my age. I'm young compared to Abraham. He took his only son and he takes two of his young men with him. Now this is interesting. Why two men and a son? Could this be mirroring the two thieves on each side of Jesus? I don't know. That's speculation on my part, but I find that the number is interesting. Everything is matching up perfectly. And he rose and went to the place of which God had told him. Again, no hesitation, only unwavering obedience on Abraham's part, even when it seems nuts. Verse 4, then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Now, some associate 3 days with Jesus being 3 days in the grave, saying to Abraham, Isaac was as if he's dead, as we're walking up there for 3 days. I think that's a conclusion. It could be accurate, but it's a conclusion on our part. It says he lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Though Jerusalem is lower, you can see it from far away. In fact, I remember standing there in Jerusalem, and it's 3 or 4 miles as the crow flies, is the mountaintop where Bethlehem is. So you can see Bethlehem from Jerusalem. You can see where Jerusalem is, even though it's down a little bit, surrounded by taller mountains. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we'll come back to you. The idea is that he left his 2 helpers on a lower location, and I'm wondering where that was. Was that down here, city of David, or maybe where they're going to build the temple someday? But in any case, he left his men, and they went up to the top of the mountain where Jesus was crucified later. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. This is the first time we see the word worship in the Bible. It's shakah, which means to bow down. Now, worship can be singing and rejoicing like we did this morning. It can be doing an act of service for the Lord. It can be bowing down humbly before the Lord. And the latter is what Abraham and Isaac were going to do. And then he says, and we will come back to you. Isn't that interesting? Why is he saying we're going to come back to you? Good morning. Abraham was going with the knowledge that he was going to offer Isaac. You have to kill him and then you burn him. Doesn't sound like Isaac's coming back. This doesn't mean that Abraham knew, well, God's going to intervene at the last second. It's really just a test. We're not really pushing the buttons to start World War III. It's just a test. No. Abraham fully understood he's going up there to offer a son. But he does mean that he knew God would do something. Maybe raise Isaac from the dead. God is able to. He had that much faith in God. If we want to understand this deeply, where do we go? What's the best commentary on the Old Testament? The New Testament, right? Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Concluding, so here we're getting a picture into Abraham's heart, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So Abraham knew, God, you promised me my kids are coming from Isaac. You want me to offer them up? All right. It's going to be interesting to see how you solve this problem. This is a perfect model for us. Abraham's modeling our task. We have to believe that God was able to raise Jesus from the dead. If you believe in your heart, Romans 10:9, if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead and confess with your mouth he's Lord, you'll be saved. We have to believe that God's able to do that. And they're even on the exact same spot. Abraham's believing that God is able to raise Isaac from the dead. We have that same heart that we need. Verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Here, son, you carry this. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife. You know, he could have said, oops, I got here, Lord, but I forgot the knife. Oh no, I guess I better go back. No, he takes the knife with him. And the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, hey, Dad, no, my father, here I am, son. Look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? So he doesn't know what's going on yet, does he? Yeah, I'm going with you. This is great. We're going to worship the Lord. Awesome. Where's the lamb? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Now, Abraham's answer gives us another clue to his heart. I don't understand what God's doing. I'm trusting and obeying him, even when it seems illogical. But God's going to do something. And God will provide himself. The lamb for a burnt offering is prophetic. God must have been speaking to his heart. Because this is prophecy. Jesus is God in the flesh, and God's going to provide himself as a lamb, as an offering for us. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac, his young buck son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Why do I add his young buck son? How old is Abraham? We don't know. He's over 100. How old's Isaac? He's a buff teenager. If Isaac didn't want to be bound, you think he could have stopped his dad? Yeah. So that tells us that Isaac is submitting to Dad. I don't know what you're doing, Dad. I don't understand this, but you're tying me up. And there's an altar right there. I guess you're going to kill me. and he's submitting to his dad. What did Jesus do? He submitted completely to his Father. Lord, let this cup pass from me, but your will, not my will. Jesus, he wasn't captured and taken to the cross against his will. He laid his life down voluntarily for us. And so in this mirror that God is creating, we see the exact same thing. The Son is obedient to the Father. Verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He was doing it. He was following through. He was about to plunge the knife. Bye, Beth. What's key here is not whether or not Abraham plunged the knife into Isaac. The key is that he was willing to. Why is that key? Because God is interested in our heart. Even before we do the actions, he knows what's in our heart. The actions just really display what's in our heart. God's interested in the heart and in our will. He knows our heart and our will before we follow through with the actions. And so he saw Abraham's heart. He's willing, he's going to do this. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. Here I am. Stop me. No, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And of course, God already knew this. So now Abraham knows that he fears God, and we know that Abraham feared God, even to the point where he did not withhold his only son. So Abraham proved his faith to himself and to us, and he created an awesome symbolic picture of Jesus. Both Jesus and Isaac were loved by their dad. They were their only sons. Both offered themselves willingly. Both carried wood up the hill to where they're going to be sacrificed. Both were sacrificed on the same hill, and both were delivered from death on the third day. Kind of cool, isn't it? It's probably just all coincidence. No, God's showing us something. Way back before Moses, way back before Jesus was even born to Mary, way back in time. We're talking a couple thousand years before Christ. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Another coincidence. Amazing. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, which in Hebrew is Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, as it is said to this day, this already happened with Isaac. They could have said, in the mount of the Lord it was provided. No, they're saying prophetically, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided, because Jesus is going to come and be sacrificed there. He's the fulfillment of the picture that Isaac was. So we have a prophecy way back in Genesis of Jesus on this spot. It's going to happen. So we've seen a very clear symbolic act that represents the sacrifice that God's going to make on behalf of mankind. He's fulfilling the promise he made back in Genesis chapter 3 when he was speaking to Satan. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. That was the first prophecy of the Messiah to come. And here God is showing us exactly how he's going to carry it out. Then in verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. He starts off saying, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord. God swears by himself because there's nothing higher he can swear by. We might say, I swear by my mother's grave or something. There's nothing higher than God. So, well, I swear by me. Makes perfect sense, actually. And it means you can believe it. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Can you imagine how pleased Abraham was to hear that? God's pleased with me. Isaac's still with me. And God has proven his love and greatness to me by not having me sacrifice my son. He came through. I was afraid I was going to have to kill him and have God raise him from the dead. No, he came through. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. Now this one's kind of interesting. In my research, Pastor Chuck quoted that in the Old Testament times, they figured out how many stars there were. They counted that sky, clear nights, they had good vision, and they counted them up. And there were 6,126 stars in the universe. That was the peak of science in their day. And innumerable, you say that, innumerable. It's kind of like trying to say aluminum or something. So, Abraham, your kids are going to be, you can't even count them, like the stars. Well, wait a minute, there's 6,126 stars, so I can count them. Uh-oh, we have a conflict in the Bible. What do you call it? A contradiction, thank you. And then he goes on and says, as the sand which is on the seashore. Now that is innumerable. You can't count the sand. So which is it, God? There's 6,000 of them, or there's going to be, you can't count them? Well, the scientists got a little bit smarter. They invented the telescope. And they realized, wow, there's more stars out there. And if you do the math, you get a bucket of sand and kind of calculate how many grains there are, and then you take a section of sky and calculate how many stars there might be, the math comes out almost equal. There's about as many stars in the universe. There's billions in a galaxy, and you got billions upon billions. So the scientists got smarter and proved that the Bible was true. Have we ever seen that before? So what do we think when the scientists tell us that it's got to be an old Earth, millions and billions of years old? And Pastor Chuck used to say, when I was a young man, it was millions of years old, and now it's billions of years old. I don't feel like I've aged that much. We can trust the Bible, and we can be skeptical about science, but it'll eventually figure out the Bible is true. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba. Who's missing in that statement? Where's Isaac? I'm sure he went back with them. What's interesting is that following his deliverance from death, Isaac disappears from the narrative. Until when, do you think? Till he gets his bride. What happens to Jesus after he's delivered from death? He kind of disappears. Until when? Till he gets his bride, the church. And the parallels go on. They continue. He gets his bride in chapter 24, so we'll get to that in the next Sunday or the Sunday after. Verse 20, now it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, indeed, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Huz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother. Great names, Huz and Buz. Easy to call them for dinner. Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begot Rebekah. She's important, isn't she? That's Isaac's wife. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Remuel, also bore Teba, Gaham, Thahash, and Mahakah. So this paragraph is in preparation for chapter 24. What it's saying is, hey, Abraham, you just got back with Isaac, and Milcah, your sister-in-law, wife of Nahor, back there where you came from, back in Iraq, where you came from, had 8 sons. Nahor, Huz, Buz, Kimil, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. I just said that again because I have so much fun saying those names. The youngest one begot Rebekah, who's going to become his wife. So next chapter, Sarah dies. We'll take a look at that. And then the next one, Isaac gets his bride. So we're going to stop there, but what's our application for this chapter? It's kind of a deep chapter. Quite a picture of the Messiah that's going to come. And God knew from the beginning that Jesus would die for us in order that we might be saved. Way back when Adam and Eve fell in the garden. This tells us that God knows everything. Nothing surprises him. When we used to do our work in Russia, lots of things went wrong. We can't get visas, or the weather's bad, or something. And we had the phrase that, you know what, I don't think God's pacing the floor yet. It's really the way it is. We have all of our plans, and God never paces the floor and worry. He knows in advance what's going on. Even our salvation, thousands of years before Jesus appeared in the flesh. Abraham and Isaac were symbolic to foretell exactly what's going to happen. I think our application, our takeaway, though, is Abraham's heart. For us to be truly useful to God, anybody want to be useful to God? Look at Abraham's heart. He had great faith in God, even when he didn't understand why. Personally, I didn't understand why when Carmen and I lost our first son. He was 3.5 years old. It was horrible. I remember one time saying, well, why me, Lord? And then after a while I thought, well, why not me? Who am I? Why should I be prevented from this tragedy? Other people go through the same tragedy. I've learned a lot through Nathan. I didn't understand why when I was showing my daughters how macho I was by barefoot water skiing, and then I let go of the rope and rolled and dislocated my shoulder, and I have chronic nerve pain now. We need idiot lights going, you're going to be an idiot, don't do that. I didn't understand why. But you know what? I've been able to relate to many of you who have chronic pain. And God said to Paul, I gave you your thorn in the side. It's a gift, Paul, to help you. Oh, thank you. Can I say no? No. There's lots of times when we don't understand the why. We need to learn that we can trust God when we don't understand the why. That's my takeaway from this chapter. I think Abraham's a great example of that. I don't get it, but you're doing something way bigger than me, and I'm going to trust you, Lord, even though I don't get it. And some of us have lost kids, or, my dad kind of shook his fist at God when my older brother died of cancer. He's kind of mad at God. He didn't understand the why. Well, my mom was saved, I believe, through my brother's death, 6 weeks before she died. I see the why. My dad never did see the why. It's so great when we can just trust God. I don't get it, but I trust you, Lord.